This video is brought to you by
Okay, let's watch this. This will make me feel a little bit better, I think.
Scentbird.
The Wisecrack video on how the Supreme Court got so powerful.
What's up, guys? Michael here to talk about a group of individuals responsible for making sure that society is just and fair.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
No, not those guys. We're talking about the Supreme Court. One of the three co-equal branches of government, it was created to provide checks and balances on the others. But as the recent leak of the current court's decision regarding Roe v. Wade hit the news, you might have wondered, wasn't this already decided? If not, are all of our laws subject to change? And how did 9 unelected folks end up with our fates in their very old hands? Let's find out in this Wisecrack edition on the Supreme Court. What went wrong?
But before we get into it, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor,
Let's start in the
partnering with us on this video, and don't miss the link in the description. And now, back to the show.
Let's start in the 18th century, when the drafters of the Constitution called for the creation of the Supreme Court as a means of balancing out the power of the President and Congress. The document establishes 3 important things about the court. First, it gives it ultimate judicial power, while allowing Congress to establish other lower courts as the
Motherfucker's name is Hate Watcher King 666. He goes, why you skip the as like a leech? Bro, your name is literally Hate Watcher King.
saw fit. Side note, it doesn't actually explicitly say what judicial power means, basically leaving Congress to eat, pray, and love on that minor issue.
Hate Watchers be like, I want to watch the ad, bro. Shut the fuck up.
Secondly, it states that judges on these courts shall hold their office during good behavior. This has been interpreted to mean that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life and don't have to leave unless they croak, retire to Florida, or do something shifty like treason or bribery. Lastly, it says that
how
judges'
dare you,
pay
Wisecrack.
can't be decreased while they're on the bench to ensure they aren't being swayed by politicians who could retaliate against court decisions by docking.
Remember when I talked about this with Ethan earlier today on the Leftovers episode? I don't know if you guys were watching it or not, but like he asked like why they have lifetime appointments, and it's because like then they're not bounded by ideology, even though that is totally false. That's the only way they get appointed anyway.
Their pay. And that's essentially what the founders had to say about it. It was up to Congress to use this blueprint and figure out what the heck a Supreme Court was anyway. Now, believe it or not, the court wasn't.
They were such dumbass libs, by the way. They were such dumbass libs for thinking like, oh, we'll just make sure they have lifetime appointments so that they don't get fucking, you know, they're uncorruptible. Like, what a fucking idiotic liberal ass fucking takeaway from anything, dude.
Intended to be an apolitical body, interpreting the law through the frame of the Constitution and not any partisan set of beliefs. Seriously, that's not a bit. That's really what it was supposed to be. The Constitution was also really vague on details regarding the establishment of federal courts outside of SCOTUS. This may have been on purpose. As law professors Richard W. Garnett and David A. Strauss put it, to some people in the United States at that time, the federal government seemed almost like a foreign government. Those people's main loyalty was to their states. As a result, a network of federal courts with elite judges handpicked by the president legislating in far-flung states amounted to allowing the foreign federal government to get its tentacles into every corner of the nation. So the issue was delicate. On the one hand, who can blame people for being worried that a bunch of hoity-toity elites with no ties to their communities can make decisions for them? On the other hand, some of the framers were concerned that leaving too much power to state courts meant that hostile states could undermine the laws of the land. Thus, Congress determined that state courts could get a fairly wide berth in figuring out local laws for themselves. At the same time, they acknowledged that the Supreme Court established the supreme laws of the land and would have the power to intervene if a state court made an unconstitutional ruling. Now, none of this would be the final say on what SCOTUS became because, and I cannot stress this enough, very little about the Supreme Court is in our actual Constitution, and early Congress had a lot to figure out, like the makeup of the court, including the number of justices and so on. Consequently, the court's responsibilities and jurisdictions have changed multiple times since its inception. So what has been the function of the Supreme Court in America? And how has that function changed? And has the institution over time become too powerful? To figure that out, let's look at one of the most pivotal moments for the court, which occurred in its tentative early days. A paradigm-changing Supreme Court decision was reached under Chief Justice John Marshall, who had been appointed during some characteristically petty theatrics between outgoing President John Adams and his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson. After Jefferson defeated Adams, the lame duck president's Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which expanded the number of federal courts and judges. Adams immediately used this new law to appoint a bunch of midnight judges, who unsurprisingly favored him. But there wasn't enough time to formally carry out all these appointments before Adams left office. Those appointees not officially commissioned were, in Jefferson's eyes, rendered null and void. One snubbed appointee was would-be DC Justice of the Peace William Marbury. He took the issue to Marshall's Supreme Court, which found that, indeed, Marbury had a right to the job. But Marshall wasn't sure if it was really the Supreme Court's place to make this ruling. To TLDR this legalese, the court decided that, for the most part, it did not have original jurisdiction, meaning it couldn't rule on a case for the first time. But it did have appellate jurisdiction. That is, the authority to rule on a case on appeal. So while Marbury was correct about his right to the job, SCOTUS did not have jurisdiction to make that call, at least not until it reached the appeal stage. Now, it might sound like the Supreme Court had ruled to limit its power, but what it really did was establish the incredibly important concept of judicial review, the power of the court to look at decisions made by the other branches of the government and other courts and determine whether or not they are constitutional. Their ruling made it official that the Constitution wasn't just a set of guidelines, but was actually the ultimate law of the land. And it was up to the Supreme Court to decide what it meant, and if daddy government was using it right. This seems to be in line with what several of the framers believed, including Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. In theory, this all means that the court is nonpartisan and exists solely to make sure everyone's constitutional rights are granted. That sounds great and non-controversial. But when you tie your decision,
except for black people, women, LGBT people, people that want to live a life devoid of gun violence,
decision-making to an
child slaves in different parts of the world that are enslaved by Nestle's subsidiaries.
Unchanging document, you sort of set yourself up to be the voice of a certain status quo, which is pretty much what SCOTUS has been since its early days. What's more, as scholars Lawrence Baum and Neil Devins argue in their study of outside influence over the court's decisions, the Supreme Court is disincentivized from making bold rulings that might be controversial, specifically because it doesn't have any ability to actually carry out its own decisions. There's no Supreme Court police force, except for the buff ghost of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
So today we're going to be working all the major muscle groups of the body. We got the abs, gams, tuchus, chicken wings, and critical thinking.
And there's no team of supervising bureaucrats to ensure that these rules...
Never mind, I like the New York gun laws now. Hopefully they repeal the California ones too, so I could just get fucking popped in a video game after watching that sketch.
Rulings are actually enacted. Thus, the fear of backlash against an unpopular opinion has always loomed large. As the researchers explain, this can often lead to justices making narrower rulings in order to avoid too much controversy. The result has been that the court is a relatively conservative body, not in a sense of Republican versus Democrat, but in terms of change versus status quo. As Kiyenga Yamada Taylor writes for The New Yorker, as the branch of government that is least accountable to the American public, the Supreme Court has tended, for most of its history, toward a fundamental conservatism, siding with tradition over more expansive visions of human rights. This makes sense because, again, they're applying an increasingly old document to any given contemporary scenario. This was certainly the case when it came to slavery, which was deemed a question best left to the states. In 1857, when the court ruled that enslaved people were property rather than citizens, the majority of judges were slave owners. Their take wasn't an aberration. While slavery isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, it did specifically protect the importing of slaves up until 1808. And the Supreme Court openly perpetuated the idea of enslaved people as protected property, even striking down a Pennsylvania law that banned using violence to collect escaped slaves. As Erwin Chemerinsky writes in his book, The Case Against the Supreme Court, at every opportunity until the Civil War, the Supreme Court acted to protect the rights of slave owners and denied all rights to those who were enslaved.
Damn, bro, that's crazy.
70 years of going to bat for guys like this.
He is a rambunctious sword, ain't he?
You might be thinking, that was a long time ago. things are way better now. And yes, the court no longer sanctioned slavery, but it did take
unless it is done by a third party and not the primary American corporation. Or also, unless prison labor as well. Unless you're in the prison system, fuck. Yeah. So technically, yes, slave labor is still totally cool and super chill and encouraged.
a whole civil war to get there. And obviously, ending slavery didn't end racism. And Chemerinsky notes that an important part of the story is that the court did nothing to advance racial equality for almost 90 years after the Civil War, and instead used its power and influence to limit the protections of the post-Civil War amendments. A prime example of this was the separate but equal decision under Plessy v. Ferguson that facilitated segregation to devastating effects on the black community. And the court siding with, say, plantation owners over enslaved people wasn't a historical aberration. It's illustrative of a larger tendency. In cases where business or corporate interests clash with those of the common man, the court has historically sided with those in power. This was illustrated acutely during the Gilded Age. From about 1890 to the 1930s, the court embraced the laissez-faire social Darwinism that dominated political thought at the time. They declared freedom of contract the freedom to independently negotiate your own business contract, a constitutional right, which allowed them to strike down tons of laws that would have protected workers and consumers from big corporations. The thinking was, if you were an employer and your state passed a minimum wage law, that was an infringement on your right to set your own employment terms. They struck down over 200 federal, state, and local economic regulations to protect the sacred right of powerful corporations. The court also took huge steps to limit federal power to protect the most vulnerable. For example, they decided that a federal ban on interstate shipment of goods produced by child labor was unconstitutional because that should be left up to the states.
Interesting. Good thing I mentioned the Nestle decision because that's like the same.
At the time, states that wanted to ban child labor risked losing their competitive business advantages to states that engaged in it. Economic pressure.
By the way, this is why I hate to admit this, and I usually try not to, but the only advances that has come for workers' rights, like the weekend, like the 40-hour work week, like the abolition of child labor, which is still very much in existence here in America, has only come at the barrel of the gun. Okay, there's labor militancy is only labor militancy is the only way you can achieve these kinds of benefits. They will never give that to you. They will never help. They will never fucking save you. They will never do this in a magnanimous way. Okay? Just not happening. Okay?
This kept child labor alive and well, and the country saw millions of children working in deadly conditions for decades. Now they just have to go to school for deadly conditions. We're not going to put that in the video, but it's and it's dark and it's true. So you know what? I dare you, editor. Put it in there. Speak truth to power. Note that just a decade earlier, the court had ruled that interstate shipment of lottery tickets could be banned by the federal government. But hey, protecting the nation from out-of-state lottery tickets, but not from child labor, seems totally normal and reasonable. Again, what we're seeing in this time period is a general reluctance to protect vulnerable people from government or corporate power. It's easy now to look back and lament the way the Supreme Court functioned pre-Civil War or in the Gilded Age, but it's worth more closely examining what happened under the court in its more progressive eras of history. Take Chief Justice Earl Warren's court, often considered the last one to truly represent the interests of the common man. Earlier courts weren't known for expanding civil rights and liberties, but Warren was openly committed to social justice. What's more, he was likable and persuasive, which led to even some of the most controversial cases that came across SCOTUS's desk reaching unanimous or near unanimous decisions from the justices, which is basically unheard of today for such divisive cases. Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark decision which reversed the separate but equal doctrine, was decided unanimously. This is directly because of Warren's influence. According to another justice's autobiography, had the Supreme Court ruled in 1952 when the case was initially argued and before Warren joined the court, there would have been a 5-4 vote to uphold segregation. What in the actual What in the actual Then there was Gideon v. Wainwright, which found that everyone has the right to legal counsel in a criminal case, and Loving v. Virginia, which ruled that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional. These decisions helped create a constitutional precedent that allowed Congress to pass other important pieces of legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But not everyone was happy with this progress, especially the definitely not a crook, Richard Nixon. Nixon maintained a 30-year beef with Earl Warren, who had refused to endorse him earlier in his political career. So when Nixon became president, he wanted to tear down everything that Warren had built. And due to some squabbling that foreshadowed Barack Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland being squashed, Nixon was able to fill 4 seats over the course of his short presidency. His goal, he said, was to appoint strict constructionists. These guys would be interpreting the law, not making the law. They would see themselves as caretakers of the Constitution and servants of the people, not super legislators with a free hand to impose their political and social viewpoints. At first glance, this sounds relatively apolitical, but it was actually the first glimmer of an important philosophy that would change the way the Supreme Court.
A bullshit philosophy. Before we get to that, I just want to point something out here, okay? Black people got like a fraction of rights, and that's all it took for motherfuckers to be like, excuse me, we need to change this immediately, okay? Like nothing, just a little bit of equality, which actually never even came. Just like equality in the books, right? And that was enough. That was enough for white people to be like, nope, we gotta change that immediately. But Hassan poops his pants. Thank you, Maya. And thank you, chatters, for not caring about, I don't know, the Supreme Court or the history of the Supreme Court or the top of the hour ad break that's here and upon us, and how all you need to do is subscribe if you want to avoid the top of the hour ad break. You know what I mean? And if you no longer want to see those ads, all you need to do is subscribe, which you can do for $5 or for free with a Twitch Prime. Connect to your Amazon Prime account to your Twitch account. You get 1 free Prime subscription a month. Here's the 1-minute ad break now. Of garbage. Shut up about the top of the hour. Lamau, piece of garbage. Lamau. Okay, bro.
Court functioned. And Nixon's strict constructionist judges were expected to roll back some of the Warren Court's broad constructionist decisions to expand human rights. That's why things like abortion or same-sex marriage aren't ruled expressly legal by the Supreme Court, but instead use constitutional reasoning like the Equal Protection Clause and the right to privacy. This is also what makes any rights not expressly delineated in the Constitution so tenuous, even if they're popular with citizens. And while Nixon's appointee, Chief Justice Burger, did not roll back the Warren Court's decisions en masse as expected, his appointment cemented an ideological shift in the court. It went from expanding civil liberties to seeing such expansions of rights as outside of the purview of the Constitution. Like its earlier iterations, this new court regularly ruled in favor of corporate and institutional interest against regular citizens. Today, the Supreme Court has several justices who follow strict constructionism, specifically what is called textualism, which holds that the Constitution should be interpreted the way your average person in 1787 would have interpreted it. How does that account for, say, the rise of global capitalism, or the invention of the AK-47, or the rise of the internet, you might be wondering? It doesn't really. But surely you must be wondering what to make of those few exciting Supreme Court cases you learned about in high school, which takes us back to the Warren Court, because it evokes a more romantic vision of the institution. And yet even some of its most groundbreaking decisions look kind of mealy-mouthed in retrospect. Take Brown v. Board, which ended legal government-mandated segregation. Surely we're not going to critique this ruling, right? Well, in reality, while the Warren Court struck down lots of individual cases brought to them about segregation in courtrooms, on buses, on golf courses, in restaurants, and so on, they never wrote an opinion that said state governments actually had to do anything to actively end segregation or prevent it from happening. Quite the opposite, in fact. As Robert L. Carter wrote in the Michigan Law Review in 1968, the court ruled that a state is under no affirmative obligation to enact anti-discrimination legislation and that such laws may be repealed. But the court added the precautionary caveat that if in the process of repeal the state tips the political balance in favor of racial discrimination, it violates the 14th Amendment. So a state not only didn't have to put any laws in place to end discrimination, but they also were within their rights to repeal anti-discrimination legislation as long as they didn't do an oopsie and tip the scales towards intentional discrimination, which is totally a very easy and objective thing to measure and prevent. Thus, I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear that virtually no school desegregation actually.
This also plays a role in the current argument that's going on with respect to voting rights. And in states like Texas, for example, as long as they are not intentionally, like openly stating that they want to stop black people from voting, if you have certain policies that end up disproportionately attacking black people, disproportionately targeting black people, i.e. disproportionately making it a lot harder for black people to go out and vote, then that's possibly appropriate. As long as the law, which by the way, that technically makes the grandfather clause and and poll taxes and stuff completely legal, constitutionally legal and appropriate. There were very few, even during the Jim Crow South, there were very few laws that expressly stated that black people can't vote. They just simply found a different way of saying black people can't vote by implementing the grandfather clause, like I said. If your grandparents were not allowed to vote, then you're not allowed to vote. See what I'm saying? Trying to derail. Why is everyone asking if you're vegan? Yeah, because there's fucking weirdos in here.
Happened for years after Brown. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that any meaningful progress was made in desegregation, and that was limited mostly to cities in the South. In San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez, SCOTUS even went so far as to rule that inequalities in school funding aren't illegal because, get this, the right to equal education isn't in the Constitution. That's right. SCOTUS ruled that it's fine for schools to be both separate and unequal as long as the segregation isn't mandated by the government. And in the 50 years since Brown, the Supreme Court has made America's segregation and inequality problems even worse. Like the 1991 decision, in which the Oklahoma City School Board ceased busing black students to white schools as a desegregation effort because schools had become less segregated. Unsurprisingly, when the busing ended, the schools became segregated again. And while there's plenty wrong with busing, SCOTUS ruled schools don't have to be equal in terms of funding, and you can probably
every single time the Supreme Court of the United States has made a decision stating that a particular anti-racist act is no longer enforceable because there's no more racism, okay? The immediate reaction to that, the immediate unrolling of said rights quickly fall apart. Like almost immediately after. Just like there are trigger laws for Roe v. Wade. In the abolition of Roe v. Wade, there are already trigger laws in place in multiple states that will immediately kick in, take effect, knowing full well that once that fucking Supreme Court decision comes down, it's over. Like, you cannot have an abortion. Another great example of this that's contemporary, even more recent than this law that we're talking about, busing in Oklahoma, which is the Voting Rights Act. The Supreme Court straight up fucking determined that it's unconstitutional for the Voting Rights Act to determine whichever jurisdiction needs additional scrutiny from the federal government. They said the red states that was getting like more scrutiny from the federal government for the ridiculous fucking checks that they were putting for in front of like black people voting. They no longer needed to do that because racism was over. And what did they do in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of the Voting Rights Act? What happened? Well, you know what happened. Every state now legally stops black people from voting in any which way they can.
Probably guess whose schools weren't being funded. Still, the court ruled that federal acts like busing were only meant as a temporary measure to remedy past discrimination. So, because black students have been given their rights for the past 13 years, the Supreme Court assumed that the racial problem at the root had been fixed. What this really meant was that schools stopped being segregated by law, but remained effectively segregated by where people lived. And because it was fine for schools to be unequal, black and Latino students suffered. Overall, if you look at the Supreme Court over the past 50 years, you can see how a general passivity towards granting rights has implicitly stripped many of those rights away from many Americans. Take the time in 2011 when a class action lawsuit against Walmart was filed on behalf of 1.5 million women, arguing that they were paid less than and had to wait longer for promotions than men. Institutionally, there was no application process for management and employees were handpicked. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in pay raises and promotions being disproportionately given to men. And while on 3 occasions the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit upheld that these women should be certified as a class, SCOTUS ruled that there were just too many of them to have enough in common to justify a class action suit. If they wanted to come after Walmart, they should do it individually instead. As Adam Cohen points out in his book Supreme Injustice, the whole point of a class action lawsuit is that individuals can collectively share claims and show ongoing patterns of wrongdoing without forking out their life savings for a lawyer. It is
No. You can't do class action lawsuits, like you have to you, underpaid minimum wage employee, have to fucking hire a lawyer individually and then go up against Walmart's ginormous fucking legal team. Yeah.
nearly impossible for one person to show that they have individually been discriminated against, whereas a large representative group demonstrates a pattern. What appears to be a neutral decision ends up being a huge loss for average Walmart workers and a huge win for
textualist / alleged rapist, textualist, retired. Huh. That's funny. What is this, bro? You just keep sending me this fucking TikTok.
It's become so normalized that we don't even realize it's a scam anymore.
The fucking Supreme Court. Not only do you have zero direct say on who gets to be on it, there are no term limits. These old fucks could be shitting in their diapers and you'd still have to do what they say. Oh, but isn't saying that ageist? Yes! Fuck old people. They don't know how to check their email. You're gonna let them run government? Fuck them. They got Candy Crush, they'll be fine.
What's a scam that's become...
I mean, I like this already because I saw it and because I think it's good and smart and I agree with it wholeheartedly. My God.
For a massive corporation. According to studies, the current Roberts Court has been the most business-friendly in nearly a century, and it's not due to party politics. Liberal and conservative judges alike seem to be able to agree on corporate rights. Meanwhile,
oh, that's crazy. Oh my God, it's almost like this is yet another product of a bourgeois government that is designed in a way to churn out results that benefit the capital owning class, oftentimes in contention against the working class. That's crazy. Almost like the distinction between liberals, Democrats, and conservatives, Republicans, is completely meaningless when it comes down to having a conversation about the rights and I don't know, the profit-seeking behavior and the protections for the profit-seeking behavior of the capital-owning class against the safety, security, sanctity of working class proletarian folk. This entire fucking system is designed in this way, dude. Of course it's going to be like this. Of course. That's how it works. That's why it is the way it is. That's why the system was designed in the way that it was designed.
While decisions that pit everyday Americans against big corporations and powerful institutions like the police and prisons leave us with little recourse to seek justice for individuals because, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, the Constitution is fair. Take the decision in Citizens United v. FEC, which said that corporations had the same rights as individuals to donate money to political candidates. In the decades that followed,
another fucking devastating decision. Like, just the absolute fucking worst, dude. God, I hate this. I fucking hate the Supreme Court. Motherfuck the Supreme Court, dude.
Wealthy donors and super PACs of every political persuasion have spent over $3 billion to sway elections toward candidates that will protect their interests. While hypothetically, everyone has the right to donate to their candidates of choice, we sadly don't have the right to the type of money that PACs have access to. Thus, the decision inherently favors one group of people, the mega wealthy. This decision isn't too surprising when you consider that 70% of Supreme Court justices in the past 50 years have been Ivy League graduates. As sociologist G. William Domhoff writes in his book, Who Rules America, there is both a funneling and homogenizing effect from these schools. This effect, he says, plays out in terms of social networks, cultural social capital, and a feeling of being part of the in-group. Scholars Baum and Devins take this further, arguing that Supreme Court justices' demographics have material effects on how they rule. They write, Supreme Court justices care more about elite audiences than they do about the mass public. As they note, like others, Supreme Court justices want most to be liked and respected by people to whom they are personally close and people with whom they identify. For the justices, those people are overwhelmingly part of elite groups. And in a system set up for checks and balances between the three branches of government, many argue that SCOTUS wields disproportionate power, including power over the will of the people, since they're able to make wildly unpopular decisions that don't reflect the majority opinions of the American public.
More minority SCOTUS? No, motherfucker. Working class. Like, this bullshit. This bullshit about, like, having all of these Supreme Court justices be, like, fucking well-educated Ivy League motherfuckers is, like, insanely stupid. Especially when they, as I've shown you before, have idiotic decisions all the time. That they write like the most idiotic fucking dissenting opinions all the time. Okay? Put like a fucking plumber on there. Who gives a shit? You know what I mean? Like, that dude is gonna have that dude is going to, even if it's on accident, no matter how fucking dumbass, no matter how big of a dumbass that plumber is, even on accident, that dude is probably going to side against large corporations more often than the actual intelligent motherfuckers who are doing this deliberately. Okay? That's the point. Like, sure, there's plenty of fucking idiots out in the real world, you know what I mean? A welder, a plumber, a trucker, whatever. They're all going to be fucking dumbasses too. There's plenty of dumbasses in that sector too. Right? So if you say, Hassan, how dare you say that, like, these guys are, you know, super well educated. It's like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't fucking matter. Because one is willingly and deliberately negligent, okay, or malicious, outright malicious. Educated, but malicious. The other one is uneducated, maybe even a fucking dumbass, but at the very least they have a heart, okay? And there's a way to, like, you know, there's a way that you can actually reach out to that person. That person and their own personal fucking experiences would guide them to make better decisions on the judicial process. Judicial review. Are you saying workers are dumb? Yes, dude. That's exactly what I'm saying. Because everyone's fucking dumb. And of course, workers are dumb too. There's plenty of fucking dumbasses. Like, what do you mean? Have you not ever worked at a work site? Like, have you not been around other individuals? Like, there were plenty of fucking dumbasses in every workplace. I'm dumb.
There's over 300 million of us and 9 of them. According to Mickey Edwards, a former 8-term member of Congress and chairman of the House Republican Policy Committee, the Supreme Court is theoretically and constitutionally separate and independent. But in reality, the separateness is a bit fuzzy. That's because even in this age of hyperpartisanship, there is at least one important area in which Democrats and Republicans think alike. Both parties view the federal courts, and especially the Supreme Court, as a de facto branch of the legislature. In other words, while everyone may talk a big game about the political neutrality of the Supreme Court, politicians of every stripe have come to understand that in reality...
Yeah, if that wasn't the case, you wouldn't see fucking Republicans running on filling the Supreme Court vacancies. You wouldn't see Democrats running on filling the Supreme Court vacancies. Of course they see it and recognize it and run with it. Of course, obviously, unfortunately, there's no Federalist Society counter because a anti-capitalist, like an anti-capitalist activist judge group would not exist. How would you ever fund that? It's much easier when power is consolidated at the top and those who are vicious and pro-capitalist can get together and funnel the funds into these sorts of world-changing organizations. Can't really do that with the left or like a leftist activist judge. Like a leftist version of the Federalist Society just does not exist. Why don't you make one, the Azan Society? It doesn't work that way, bro. I mean, maybe. The closest we can get to something like that, and stop doing fucking fund that $5 a month. I already ran the ad, okay? Stop. I already ran the ad, please. The closest we can get to that is something like this. This community itself. There are plenty of people in this community that are in law school. There are people in this community that are community organizers in general in the workforce. Like, that's the only thing. That's the only way that, like, there could be some kind of systemic change. But that's it. Like, there's no other way to do that. There's no other way to push for societal change within the capitalist system. No matter what happens, you have to tackle it from the outside. It's very difficult to do that. And then there's plenty of fucking dumbasses in here too. So there is that.
Whichever party appoints the most justices wields the most power, particularly in a Congress too divided to do much of anything. Does this sound kind of undemocratic? Well, that may have been the original point. At the New York ratifying convention for the Constitution, Hamilton himself said that there are few positions more demonstrable than that there should be in every republic some permanent body to correct the prejudices, check the intemperate passions, and regulate the fluctuations of a popular assembly. This is basically like fancy colonial talk for a rather chilling argument, that we need special appointed people to protect us from our...
Bro, that's so crazy. I can't believe that there was an entire body. I cannot believe that there was an entire body in Congress that was also designed around that same principle. It's called the Senate. I can't believe... Oh, wait, hold on. There's more to it. I can't believe that there was another principle called the Electoral College, another system called the Electoral College that also churned out these exact same outcomes. It almost feels like our founding fathers just simply were like, we really fucking hate democracy, okay? We're gonna make it seem like we have a democracy, but like we're gonna make sure every step of the fucking way that no like pure democratic outcome is ever going to happen, okay? You don't have a democratic process for electing the president. You have the Electoral College, okay? You don't have a democratic process within the Senate. You can have 40 million more votes that vote for the fucking Democratic Party in Senate elections, and then, there's still a Republican majority Senate. 40 million! How fucking insane is that? Okay? And then the one body that is supposed to have proportional voting is the House of Representatives. That's supposed to truly represent the population sizes. Even there, you have gerrymandering, redistricting, that stops even the fucking House of Representatives from being democratic. And it doesn't matter. So yes, the Supreme Court is just yet another profound example of the underlying unequal structure of American governance.
Our literal democracy. Side note, classic Greek philosopher Plato would largely agree on this. Or, as Chemerinsky puts it, the primary reason for having a Supreme Court, then, is to enforce the Constitution against the will of the majority. This seems true in the expected decision ruling against Roe v. Wade, which 64% of the country wants to see upheld. You may be thinking, well, then we should change the Constitution. But this was, by design, made very, very, very difficult to do. So in a lot of ways, we're all still operating by a playbook written by slave owners in the late 1700s. As Chemerinsky adds, why should a society generally committed to majority rule choose to be governed by a document that is very difficult to change? And we've only grazed the tip of the iceberg. If you dig deeper, you'll find a history of the court supporting things like eugenics, Japanese internment camps, severely limiting free speech in times of war, and so on. So, is the Supreme Court beyond fixing? There are senators and representatives who have proposed changes, such as expanding the court, imposing term limits, and other measures to curb the massive power currently afforded to every Supreme Court justice. Of course, with the filibuster still in place, putting any of these changes in motion is basically impossible, and all of these measures seem like insurmountably uphill battles. But if the court continues to make unpopular decisions, maybe it'll finally spur the kind of backlash they've been dreading.
No, it won't. No, it won't. We're pussies. We have no power. We have no mechanism to strike back. There's no fucking work. There's no labor militancy. There's nothing. Why do you think 50% of the budgets in every fucking locality go to the police force, brothers and sisters and MBs? Why? Because if something like this actually ended up happening, full-blown societal collapse, you had at least a line of defense. Okay? You have a line of defense to maintain that like order at a time when there's so much disorder and so much lawlessness, at a time when if you are a working class individual, you are shafted regardless. At a time, if you're a woman, you're not allowed to have control over your own body. You don't have bodily autonomy. You want to fight back against that? You want to take matters in your own hands? The fucking cops will kill you. They'll beat the shit out of you, okay? You protest where you're not supposed to protest? Good luck. You're going to get a baton shoved in your ass, okay? That's it. Yeah, they'll fucking kill you. The Supreme Court strikes down a Washington law that made it easier for certain workers to get workers' comp from the federal government if they became sick while cleaning up a decommissioned nuclear site. SCOTUS says the law violates the doctrine of intergovernmental immunity. The decision was unanimous. Most pro-business Supreme Court in existence
since 1787.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
But what do you guys think? Are the 9 perfect strangers not so perfect after all? Or should we give them more credit for legislating with less than ideal guidance from the founding fathers? Let us know in the comments. Thanks to our patrons.
All right, this was Wisecrack's video, How the Supreme Court Got So Powerful. It was pretty good, by the way. I do high-key recommend it. Good stuff, good stuff, good stuff. Very cool. There's going to be one last... We forgot to do the they-them per... well, not a they-them per, let's be real. I think...